Hey everyone, super excited to see you again. It is week 6, meaning we are kind of like shockingly halfway through our study of the Black Jacobins. Kind of funny because if you look at it, we're actually not halfway through the book. But there's a logic to that. It makes a certain kind of sense. And we're getting through some dense material in these first sessions. Last week, we talked about the way that in James's framing, the San Domingo masses began, were set into motion. In other words, we were talking about the outbreak of the mass slave rebellion that emerged in what would become Haiti, and the way that that was itself sparked by and was the product of a mass struggle in France, and the way that that mass struggle in France had created the space for the demand for equal rights for mulatto and mixed race people in the colony. Right? That transatlantic back and forth was exactly what, in James's framing, awoke the sleeping slaves, right? Created a space for them to then demand, as he understood it, their rights, according to and through a sort of process of translation of the rights of man that were being spoken of in France into a concrete reality, right? From words on paper into concrete and lived abolition of slavery. We talked also about the very potent way that James, if you remember the beginning of that chapter, described enslaved people in Haiti, this very concentrated way. The slaves worked on the land, and like revolutionary peasants everywhere, they aimed at the extermination of their oppressors, but working and living together in gangs of hundreds on the huge sugar factories which covered the North Plain. They were closer to a modern proletariat than any group of workers in existence at the time, right? So we discussed and analyzed the way that this potent framing and opening of that chapter really confounds Marxist categories of peasantry, how they're related to revolution, and how all of those relate to factory labor, even as James himself is applying Marxist materialist analysis. And very specifically, we spent a lot of time trying to understand the way that he was applying a very Marxist understanding of the importance of space for revolutionary consciousness, right? The geography of capitalism creating a kind of spatial, constraint, containment that then becomes almost like a pressure cooker that creates revolutionary consciousness. He's seeing very much the same happening among enslaved people. We talked about how, thirdly, the slaves destroyed once the rebellion began, but this was not because they didn't want to build, right? This is the sort of white supremacist understanding of what a slave revolt, a rebellion, or in modern kind of times, a riot, is understood to be something destructive, irrational, something that has no logic, makes no sense, and which has no image of the society that it wants to build, right? James says they destroyed because they had no use for the plantation. They were rebelling against slavery, which is a form of status-based labor, and they were rebelling against the plantation itself, which will become incredibly important as we move forward. And James really emphasized in this destructive process that marked the beginning of the slave insurrection that, like all oppressed people, their violence was much, much less than the violence of their oppressors, right? It was momentary, it was moderate, it was restrained in its own kind of way. And again, that's him playing a little defense in terms of the historic racism that understands certain forms of resistance as being inherently violent because it understands certain people as being inherently violent, right? Biologically and racially. Finally, we talked about Toussaint himself, right? About what it was that he did when the slave rebellion started, which was nothing, right? To wait, to take care of the plantation even. And we talked about how that reflected who he was, what kind of a person, what kind of a character. And we talked a lot about, and we'll talk even more about why it matters for James, what kind of a person Toussaint was. And again, this is something that he has been repeating throughout this sort of cycle, this very Marxist sort of circle of chicken and egg, which is we change the world, but the world makes us, creates us to be who we are. And so how is it that we are then changing the world that is changing us, right? This is something that Toussaint and all great leaders, exist. They exist in a sort of cycle in an especially powerful and potent and crucial way. As we move on to chapter 5, again, the framing is the San Domingo masses begin, the Paris masses are now going to complete in James's framing, and we're riding essentially what James had referred to paraphrasing Marx, as the revolutionary locomotive of history. He said this was a locomotive that had traveled incredibly far, incredibly fast. And so where did it leave us at the end of last week? We're talking about the middle of 1792. The rebellious masses of Paris had opened up a breach in history into which mixed race mulattoes rose up in rebellion, demanding equal rights. And this is around the period of 1790. The French Revolution begins in 1789. 1790 into 1791, this sort of back and forth is happening. Mixed race people are demanding their rights in Paris. And this is, in James's word, the quarrel that woke the sleeping slaves, who themselves rose up in 1791, some 2 years after the emergence of the French Revolution. Now, in this process, James is always looking for historical laws. And we shouldn't overstate the sort of law-ishness of these laws, because history is made of people, once again. So any laws governing history are also fundamentally social. It's people that are acting in relation to those laws that they themselves are producing. But we're still looking for laws with James, right? And here we find one, which is in some ways the counterpart to something he'd already talked about, the paradoxical ways that revolutionary change from below was beginning with fractures in the power structure from above, right? This sort of slightly paradoxical framing. In other words, struggles at the top create space in the middle for intermediate classes in particular, mixed race mulattoes and the bourgeoisie, to make demands. And the middle making these demands then creates space through the conflict that it unleashes. It creates space and possibility for far more radical demands to emerge from the grassroots at the bottom. This is the kind of dynamic that he had laid out previously. This is a chain reaction, and it runs all the way down, right? It doesn't run out of power until it hits the bottom or something else happens, until it's sort of cut off in some way. And we see the same kind of dynamic in many revolutionary processes throughout history. And it's the last thing that powerful elites or even the middle sectors want when they begin the revolutionary process. So one really great example is the Mexican Revolution, where liberal reformers are fighting for free constitutional elections under the leadership of Francisco Madero, and ultimately oust the dictator Porfirio Diaz. But in so doing, they inadvertently spark a land revolution of poor peasants, particularly in the south of the country, led by Emiliano Zapata, among others. Again, this is not what the liberal reformers are trying to do at all, right? And it's in response to this in 1911 that the dictator Porfirio Diaz allegedly said, Madero has unleashed the tiger. Let's see if he can control it, right? So we're talking about unleashing the tiger of mass struggle inadvertently, accidentally, and then having to control it once it's unleashed. But here's another kind of opposing law. What do those in power do once such rebellious tigers have been unleashed? They run to the middle, desperately in search of a compromise that might head off the radicals and the demands from below. This often leads to the kind of partial changes that Gramsci refers to as a passive revolution, or a revolution without a revolution, instituting only the most minimal reforms necessary to preserve the system and to prevent it from collapsing entirely. This happened at first in Mexico. We see it very clearly as well in the civil rights movement, which the government demonized, of course, until the Black Power movement arrived, at which point MLK becomes the saint that the system claims that he is today, right? This is the process, this is part of that process of the unfolding whereby far more radical demands scare the shit out of the establishment, and the next thing you know, you have the establishment signing the Civil Rights Act and embracing King, right? It's a partial revolution. It's a passive revolution because the goal is to preserve the system and not see it overthrown. It's not a law that be the outcome. I want to be super clear, because these things get out of hand, right? And they get out of the hands of those in power. Once they've reached that point, they're already far beyond what was hoped. And we already saw this dynamic emerging in France, with the fear that all sectors had of the Parisian masses and, of course, of the Black slaves as well, leading to an alliance between the right wing of the bourgeoisie and the monarchy on the one hand, and the granting of rights to mulattoes on the other. That's part of the passive revolution. Often, however, those in power radically underestimate the power of the people and dramatically overestimate their own, making these petty reforms too little and too late, effectively. This, of course, was more than true of Haiti, where the bourgeois centrists in France, known as the Girondins, would consistently overplay their hand until things were well out of their control. We'll see more of that today. So we ended last week with the bourgeois consensus on granting right to mulattoes, right? That was the consensus. Ironically, it's when the slaves are in full rebellion that the system then says, oh shit, we'd better give rights to not the people actually engaged in rebellion at that moment, but to the much smaller class of property mixed race people that had claimed it earlier, right? So it's a passive revolution. It's a small change in an attempt to preserve the system. And the flip side, of course, of that consensus to give and grant rights to mulattoes was to crush the slave rebellion, right? That was the implication. That was the consequence. So 6,000 troops are en route to San Domingo. And when they arrived, they were as divided as France was at this tense tipping point of the revolution on both sides of the Atlantic. The officers were royalists, loyal to the king, but the commissioners, meaning their bosses, were revolutionaries. And they were led by what a person that James refers to as a right-wing Jacobin, namely Sonthonax. He says right wing. He doesn't mean the right wing of the right. He means the right wing of the left. So more or less in the center. He's a bit more of a Girondin. The soldiers themselves were also divided, and they were divided into the troops, what he calls the troops, the official, enlisted troops, who were more royalist, and the National Guard, who were more civilian revolutionaries. Now, on page 119, right at the beginning of the chapter, James says something peculiar. This is sort of at the end of the first paragraph. He says, the commissioners carried the revolution on board with them. They went to meet it, but what was of infinitely more importance for the slaves, they had left it behind them. It's just a bizarre sentence. It's very hard to understand what he's referring to until you kind of continue into the next paragraph, where the first thing he begins to talk about is what was going on in Paris simultaneously, right? And in other words, what was going on and what had been left behind was the action of the masses that was ongoing. They had sailed from Paris, this sort of a flotilla of 6,000 troops. They had sailed in July. But before they had even landed, this is in James's words, the Parisian masses had taken matters into their own hands and dragged the Bourbons off the throne. Had taken matters into their own hands once again, right? So what's being left behind is this action is being left behind in this very funny sort of delayed space of happening and not being known, right? The gap between something happening in France and being known in San Domingo is sometimes, at least a month and up to 2 or 3. So what's going on in Paris? The hamstrung centrists of the revolution, in other words, the Girondins, had chosen war with Austria. Over meeting the basic needs of the Parisian poor. And in this context, the royal family conspired openly with the enemies of France. We know this had been going on from the beginning. And treason is a major driving force throughout this history. It's radicalizing the people because they see the monarchy as betraying even the very basic needs of the country. And this is not treason necessarily on a national level. It's also a class treason. It's treason in the name of a continental counter-revolution that we're talking about, actually a multi-hemispheric counter-revolution once we really consider it. The Girondins, again, were, in James's words, more afraid of the Paris masses than of the monarchy, and they failed to act when action was most necessary. But central to James's analysis, the masses are the ones that knew what was necessary, right? They had this sort of intuitive grasp of what was needed, as he's put it, at every stage of the revolution. Once again, they had taken matters into their own hands, and what they did was they stormed into the Tuileries Palace. If anyone's expecting me to pronounce French words correctly, I hope, it's what Tuileries, the Tuileries Palace on August 10th. So August 10th is really the key date. They'd stormed the palace on August 10th and they dragged the Bourbons off the throne, right? They abolished the monarchy. The masses abolished the monarchy. They'd already kidnapped the king multiple times to get certain pieces of legislation, the rights of man approved, the abolition of certain feudal privileges, all very partial measures. Now they got rid of the monarchy, right? And if we remember from last time, there was the massacre of protesters in Paris had been really the last blow against the monarchy, because it was then that the demand to actually abolish it gained steam. The most revolutionary sectors of Parisian society here, of course, we're talking about the Sans-Culottes, but we're also talking about the Cordeliers, the sort of very radical elements of the Jacobin clubs. We're talking about the Commune, again, not the later Commune of 1871, but the sort of central governing force of Paris, downtown Paris, which had been seized by radicals in August of 1792. All of these forces, the masses in the streets backed by these radical forces, imprisoned the royal family in September. They imprisoned the royal family in August, and then in September of 1792, they massacred around 1,500 conspirators, counter-revolutionaries, right, who they feared would join any invading army. There's a war going on with Austria. Everyone knows that the monarchy is conspiring with the leaders. They're worried that if an Austrian army enters the country, that all of these other forces would join them. So they kill 1,500 people. It's kind of a significant and wild number of people being killed. People still crying about it today. It is what it is. As James puts it, the masses administered a rough justice and took the defense of France into their own dirty but strong and honest hands. If revolutionary France was saved, it was due to them. So they were the ones that pulled the monarchy off the throne. They were the ones that imprisoned the king. They were the ones that then took all of these, most of them prisoners, and massacred them, and then many out in the streets. There was basically a general call going around to hunt counter-revolutionaries, and that's what was happening. And at least in James' assessment, they defended France, they saved it, and they saved the revolutionary process, right? James is writing clearly a counter-history to this long-standing bourgeois narrative of the tragedy of the French Revolution. Revolution that went too far, that might have been guided by important principles, but that took them to sort of unacceptable lengths. Page 120, immediately after that. What has all this to do with the slaves? Everything. The workers and peasants of France could not have been expected to take any interest in the colonial question in normal times, any more than one can expect similar interest from British or French workers today. But now they were roused. They were striking at royalty, tyranny, reaction, and oppression of all types, and with these, they included slavery. The prejudice of race is superficially the most irrational of all prejudices, and by a perfectly comprehensible reaction, the Paris workers, from indifference in 1789, had come by this time to detest no section of the aristocracy so much as those whom they called the aristocrats of the skin. And further down, henceforth, the Paris masses were for abolition, and their black brothers in Saint Domingo for the first time had passionate allies in France. In other words, the Parisian masses had intervened in politics before, but previously had been kind of on their own behalf. They were fighting for their own struggles. They were fighting for their own liberation. They had been pressing forward the most radical wing of revolutionary fervor that tended towards socialist demands rather than the very limited demands of the centrist government. But revolutionary fervor is contagious. It throws everything into disorder, as James has said, and it breaks down all barriers, specifically the barrier, and again, sorry about boring you with the constant repetition, but it's so important for this book, breaking down the barrier between the word and the thing, right? The word slavery and the thing slavery, the word freedom and the thing. Opposed to tyranny, prejudice, and the unearned privilege of an absolutist monarchy, it was only natural that the insurrectionary radicals of Paris would begin to see their plight as one shared by enslaved people as well, oppressed as they were by these aristocrats of the skin. But we shouldn't forget that this radical realization, indeed this revelation, was not produced solely in Paris or solely through the dynamics of the French struggle. A key ingredient, if not the key ingredient, was this, what James writes immediately afterward. The slaves in Saint Domingo, by their insurrection, had shown revolutionary Paris that they could fight and die for freedom. And it was this more than anything else that led as what James calls a logical development to a situation in which The masses, when they said abolition, meant it in theory and practice. In other words, meant it in the word, but also the thing. So there's a logical development from observing the struggle in San Domingo to then that being transferred into your own understanding of the materiality of what freedom and abolition should mean. And crucially, the masses from this point on would be in the driver's seat, propelling the most radical Jacobins to power and holding their feet to the revolutionary flame. In other words, this isn't just an abstract idea of revolutionary contagion, like whenever there's a revolution or a revolutionary struggle, ideas have a contagious spread, which is true, but we're also saying something more specific and something more kind of powerfully dialectical. We've mentioned Hegel's master-slave dialectic before, and here's another piece. If fighting for freedom from oppression transforms us internally, setting into motion a kind of expanding cycle of self-consciousness, this is very much at the heart of Hegel's argument. It's the heart of Fanon's writing. We found it in Du Bois previously. If this transforms us and develops our own self-consciousness, the same goes in a certain way for those who see us fight. Does that make sense? And where the question is one of white supremacy, this piece becomes even more essential. Recall that one of the main ways that slavery leans on racism is the very kind of propaganda that James and Du Bois both had been trying to counteract. The idea that enslaved people were happy because this was their natural state, that they didn't understand freedom, that they didn't want freedom, that they wouldn't fight for their own freedom. So in this context, fighting and dying for freedom is an incredibly effective way to immediately and in an instant kind of disprove this white supremacist ideology. And Du Bois had said something very similar and interesting when it came to the Civil War, which resonates very clearly with James's statements on the tragedy of historical progress. This is what Du Bois writes in Black Reconstruction. How extraordinary and what a tribute to ignorance and religious hypocrisy is the fact that in the minds of most people, even those of liberals, only murder makes men. The slave pleaded, he was humble, he protected the women of the South, and the world ignored him. The slave killed white men, and behold, he was a man. This is that Hegelian dynamic. And sad though it may be, this too approaches the level of a historical law. Think of the way that despite all the begging and the pleading and the humility and the rational argumentation, it took and it always takes a Ferguson, a Baltimore, a Minneapolis to shift white consciousness when it comes to police violence, for example, right? And to be clear, white consciousness did shift. They do these polls, very interesting polls on, perceptions of whether or not, say, police violence is a structural problem, right, versus just like bad apples. They did these after Watts in the 60s, and they did it, sort of running up right to the present. And after these rebellions, you see a shift in how even white people view these questions. Right? And the shift after Minneapolis was the biggest shift that they'd ever seen. Why? Because you're watching people fighting for freedom. And there's something that tells us that if people are fighting for freedom, they truly are up against something real, and they're, and they're struggling for something that we should identify with. So these dynamics do set consciousness into motion, and they do play a key role, again here tragically, in the retreat of white supremacy and white supremacist understanding. So, okay, where are we? We're talking about the invading force still, sort of still on the first page. 6,000 people arriving in San Domingo, and they arrive on September 18th. Remember, August 10th is the abolition of the monarchy. September 18th, they're arriving, but they don't know what's happening in Paris, which means they don't know that any of that was happening, any of the dynamics, and there are many such cases throughout the text. Now, they'd been sent to put down a slave rebellion, but also sent to enforce the rights granted to mixed race people in this consensus. And they expected white resistance to this attempt to impose mulatto rights. But some of the initial appearances when the soldiers arrived tended to support the idea that the color question was settled according to that consensus already. Quote, 3 years, this is on 121, 3 years of civil war 1 year of the slave revolution had taught these white planters some sense, at least. In other words, that their back was against the wall. They needed to accept this small change, this passive revolution, in an attempt to prevent something far larger. Now, James writes, there was prejudice, of course, which in his words cannot be destroyed in a day or a year, but the planters wanted peace. And so they had to accept this new reality of this most passive of revolutions, according to which there were now only two classes, free, regardless of color, and slave. Right? Of course, things are far more complicated than that, but this was the new consensus. On the second piece of the mission of these soldiers, in other words, the attack on the slave insurrection, it never came. Just like the Girondins in France, the commissioners that had been sent to San Domingo were hamstrung by divisions and unable to act decisively. This is such a key part of the way this story continues to play out. Those in power cannot act decisively. This is always an advantage that we'll have over those in power. We only need to look at, of course, the Democrats today to see the absolute picture of structural indecisiveness. I say structural because their role is to perform a certain kind of class politics, and it creates a situation in which they cannot be decisive. And they cannot act in any kind of decisive way. So they wring their hands, they complain, and they do fuck all. So when news of August 10th arrived, meaning the abolition of the monarchy and the overthrow, when that arrived on the island, so in October now, a month after the troops had arrived, this indecisiveness turned into open warfare between revolutionaries and royalists. Again, both largely bourgeois factions, but who were divided not only, as James insists, over the question of the monarchy, but also about the fact that August 10th was much more than that, right? His point here, this is on 122, is that if it was just about the monarchy, the bourgeoisie would throw the monarchy overboard as long as it didn't touch their interests, right, and their property. But the suspicion, particularly for the royalists, was that this went much further, right, or for whatever realignment of the royalist faction then came about. It was, according to James, a bid. It was the bid of the masses for power, not with speeches, but with arms. Again, think Marx, material force defeats material force. The royalists broke their détente with the mulattoes and returned to race prejudice against the revolution and returned to race violence, right? Prejudice in the name of violence. Quote, once more, the division between the rulers had given further breathing space to the ruled. This is James identifying these, again, historical laws. The division between the rulers had given further breathing space to the ruled. The unified and direct attack against the slave insurrection didn't materialize. And here the fragmentation of the soldiers, the troops, and the fighting force reflected something much deeper that James insisted was no accident. If you look at page 123, he says, right, sort of a third of the way down, page 123. This apparent good fortune was fundamentally no accident. The first sign of a thoroughly ill-adjusted or bankrupt form of society is that the ruling classes cannot agree on how to save the situation. The first sign of a bankrupt society is that those in power don't know how to get out of a crisis. And that's what turns crises into transformations and transitions. This is just gesture loosely at the world around us to see that this is true, and to see that the bankruptness is all around us. Of course, we've spoken of interregnum, we've spoken of the dying world with the absence of whatever is coming next. That's exactly what we're looking at, and it speaks to this dynamic. James continues, it is this division which opens the breach, and the ruling classes will continue to fight with each other just so long as they do not fear the mass seizure of power. So they will continue to fight with each other as long as their expectation is that it's not creating a breach big enough for more radical demands to open up. We see a sort of cycle here, right? As soon as the threat from below then emerges, they coalesce into some kind of consensus. As soon as they feel like that threat has receded, they break open again into warfare over their particular interests. And this then creates space for the down below. Now, this wouldn't ever work in our favor if the ruling classes had consistently good and accurate judgment of what is possible from below, but they do not, again. They underestimate the people. And they particularly underestimate people who are not white, right? So you have this double whammy of the ruling class unable to conceptualize a slave revolution, and so they mistake the calculus of what it would take to maintain the system as it is, if that makes sense. This is a dramatic advantage. Despite this, the insurrection was losing steam, and it was losing some important battles. The slave rebels were forced back into the mountains. Famine and disease were hitting them incredibly hard. They were dividing their forces. James refers to what he calls mulatto vacillation. Again, one of many moments in which mulattoes, understood as an intermediary class, are vacillating because of their structural position in between two forces, right? So what he means by that in this case is some sectors abandon the struggle, their alliance with enslaved people, and they rejoin the French, right? But right when the French seemed as if they were on the verge of victory, the troops were then recalled due to events at home. What were those events? In January of 1793, the king was executed. So kind of a big event. But even bigger than that and more pressing when it came to the military question was the fact that France was sort of launched into war with half of Europe. So you've got this mass war going on. The king is executed. The French Republic is finally kind of unavoidable. And as a result, the slave insurrection gets a bit of a respite, right? They're up in the mountains, they're suffering, and then suddenly the French withdraw, right? Yet another division among their enemies meant yet another opportunity for the slaves. And despite everything that we have said, is very interesting, despite everything that we've been saying about the dynamics of the revolutionary France, about the development of revolutionary consciousness among the Parisian masses, it's really important to understand that it had not taken any steps to abolish slavery. It had done the opposite, right? Up to this point, again, up to 1793. It had decided not to abolish slavery. It had decided instead to crush the insurrection and drive them back into slavery. So James is very clear that if the black rebels, this is on page 124, if the black rebels did not know which of these sides in the European wars that were unleashed best represented their interests, this was not their fault at all, but it was the fault of a so-called revolution that was prevaricating in the face of actual freedom. So he says at the top of 124, for the moment the blacks did not know where their true interests lay. Again, very similar to what Du Bois says of the beginnings of the general strike against slavery. And notice here, again, that James sees the unlettered slaves, the unorganized slave population as fully capable of making this determination of where their interests lay and acting on it, right? They know, as masses know, according to James, more or less what is, happening in the situation. Why does this matter concretely? It matters because here come the Spanish, quote, offering them guns and supplies, recognizing them as soldiers, treating them as equals, and asking them to shoot other whites. Naturally, they accepted, right? France had done nothing to free enslaved people. It was attacking them. Here come the Spanish, engaged in a continental and transnational war against the French, which is a war for royal power against the revolution. But here they are pulling up on the shores of San Domingo. I mean, they're already sort of on the other side of the island, offering enslaved people weapons to fight against the French and to be free in practice, right? Naturally, James says, they accepted. Of course they fucking accepted, right? No one else is freeing them. It may seem strange that this put Toussaint on the side of royalty and reaction against what James calls the godless, kingless republic. But for him, this is again James talking about Toussaint. For him, already, these slogans were merely politics, not convictions. And again, for an enslaved people, abolition comes first, and it's hard to see, in fact, why anything else would matter at that point, right? James describes, in this context, the slaves are joining the Spanish. They're joining technically the side of the counter-revolution against the French. James describes the ingenious ways, this is the last thing I'll say, and then we can go to take some questions. He describes the ingenious attempts by Toussaint to turn this fundamental principle, in other words, that abolition comes first for the enslaved, that is the primary question, that's been his primary motivation for several years now. Toussaint, in an incredibly ingenious way, turns this principle into strategy. And this is a sort of a complicated point, but I think it'll be pretty clear. What do I mean by this? He proposes to the Spanish that by freeing enslaved blacks, they would immediately defeat the French, right? It's true, right? If the Spanish were the ones that said, we're going to free the enslaved people, all of those enslaved people would then suddenly be on the side of the Spanish. So Toussaint takes this as a proposal, right? Again, he in principle is dedicated to that abolition, but he sees it in an incredibly powerful way as the only way to win as well, the only way for either side to win. And so he's willing to use that as a bargaining chip. The Spanish refused, and so he wrote to the French, basically proposing the same thing. He's saying, listen, I will come back to the side of the French if you free enslaved people. The French refused too. Bizarre. All of which, in James's words, left Toussaint allied with the Spanish and, quote, baffled that no one seemed to want to win the war, right? Either side could have won at that point. Now, it's worth noting in James' notes here in the text that Toussaint's last name, Louverture, is not his, was not his original last name. It's a name that he picked up, assumed. And it means, very literally, the opening, right? And it was the opening for a reason, right? Here we see him not only seizing openings, but also creating openings through strategic decision. We see him, in James's words, riding two horses at once, fighting for the monarchy in name, while also declaring freedom and equality in practice, again, with the word and the thing. I think I'll stop and take a few questions there before we get into some other dynamics that play out in the rest of the chapter. What have folks got? In the chat, in the room.
So I understand that Toussaint is siding with the Spaniards just mostly for strategy.
Mm-hmm.
Does he anticipate this? I guess I'm not sure because they say no. Like, I guess I'm just wondering why he sticks with the Spanish despite them saying no.
Mm-hmm.
Um, like, is the French considered a bigger enemy? And
Mm-hmm.
had the Spanish said yes, like, do you think that Toussaint would anticipate them perhaps not being honest or sticking to their word? Like, do you think he just had like a greater plan that was beyond these two fighting nations?
Yeah, that's a great question. So why be with the Spanish if they also said no? Why be with the Spanish if they weren't also, if they were also opposed to freeing enslaved people? I think the answer is that for Toussaint, France is not the bigger enemy. If anything, we're going to see the many ways in which France is, Toussaint has a great appreciation for France. And he certainly deep down has an appreciation for what's happening in the revolution, right? Now, again, primary is the abolition of slavery. Neither side is offering it, so why be with the Spanish and not the French? It's a sort of minor difference given the fact that neither side is offering what it is that he's actually looking for. But the main, I would say, deciding factor is the fact that this is freedom in practice, right? They're being armed. They are being treated as equals, as James puts it. They are engaged in this struggle. They're in a very real sense free. And what that's, again, spoiler, what that's going to build into is actual freedom and actual autonomy for him as a leader, right? So this whole time, and already starting even a year before this, he's building an army. He's training an army. He knows, and as James describes it, that freedom is won by force, and that is going to be the primary thing he's going to dedicate himself to, not to words, not to debates and politics. He's going to be focused on the force that will win and guarantee freedom. And that's what he's been doing, right? So I think staying with the Spanish at this point is just a continuation of that, right? Yeah. What else?
Um, I guess he and you have both really explained like why the Paris masses were pro-abolition, but I guess thinking about the way that the small whites in San Domingo were like the most entrenched race prejudice, like can you explain more what separated, I guess, the dynamics between those two groups of like lower class whites?
Yeah, that's a great question. And there's a reason that James doesn't align the small whites with the masses at all, right? He aligns them with, you know, elements of the aristocracy, right? And it's because in this context, the aristocracy of the skin is a very real thing. And again, if we remember, so at the very beginning, James has this funny footnote where he's almost like channeling Du Bois and saying, these poor whites are not the same as the poor whites in the American South. The poor whites in the American South were absolutely proletarianized, poor elements who were then conscripted into policing enslaved people, yes, but for whom, at least to Du Bois, and maybe James is suggesting this, there was the potential for some kind of actual class solidarity potential, right? Very long shot potential, but still potential. What James is describing about the small whites is very different. They are not only, you know, they're not just like any other poor whites, the defenders of white supremacy, because it's, you know, it's the most important thing they have. They also lived it in a certain kind of way that sets them apart from the US context. In other words, as he puts it, and again, this is a basic demographic thing, right? 90% of the population is enslaved. So the class of small whites is not the millions that existed in the US South, right? It's a very small class, and it's a class that, by virtue of its privileged position, actually lived a different kind of life. Owned slaves, could use slave labor, lived off of the labor of all of those enslaved people in a way that made them not a working class at all, and that made them not act in the same way as a sort of like dispossessed masses, if that makes sense. They had real privilege of whiteness as property that meant real differences, if that makes sense. You know, again, it's maybe a question of degree rather than type, but for James at least, and you see it, I think, in the actions, this is not a class that's going to be voluntarily brought to the right side at all. And in this sense, it shares more with like the Pieds Noirs in Algeria or something, sort of the white French colonists for whom they cannot imagine their life without this absolute domination of a native population or an enslaved population, right? This is what's so essential about their condition, and that's why in Algeria these were the fascists, right? These were the, you know, the backbone of fascist reaction. Now, again, an element of this, you know, of this poor class in the U.S. South, of course, is also that, right? But it has a different relationship to the power structure that swings back and forth, that gains certain kinds of autonomy, and that makes certain other kinds of claims in different moments. So, if that makes sense. What else? Got any more? Are we good? Cool. Because we have lots of things to talk about. So Toussaint has offered this to the Spanish, offered it to the French, and meanwhile is building his power. Now, the strategy that Toussaint had offered was, in fact, ineluctable reality, which is to say, faced with defeat at the hands of the counter-revolution, Sontenax, again, the French commissioner in Le Cap, armed the slaves and prisoners, promising them their freedom. He was surrounded in the capital city. There was no other way out for him, and so finally he did arm enslaved people. For freedom, they would in fact fight, and some 10,000 armed slaves surrounded the royalist forces, thousands of whom then fled, many, as James suggests, to the US. This was the tipping point. In James' words, this is over on 127. It was the end of white domination in San Domingo. But he immediately adds, in terms of the agency of who's sort of ending that domination, this is how white San Domingo destroyed itself. And he's here disagreeing with and counteracting and attempting to undermine, again, historical propaganda about who destroyed the white, you know, society of San Domingo. He rejects what he calls the shameless lie of massacres against the whites by which reaction covers its crimes. They only granted rights to the mulattoes in James's argument when it was too late. Not primarily because of racism, but because, as he puts it, those, this is at the very bottom of 127, those in power never give way. And again, this is James, be super clear about what he's trying to do here. He is saying that political classes act the same way no matter what color they are, no matter where they're located. Masses act the same way no matter what color they are, no matter where they're located. He's engaging in this kind of universalizing gesture. Again, when he said the slaves destroyed, he said so did the Luddites, right? When he says the elite in San Domingo clung to power, he said not because of what race necessarily, although of course that's a big piece of it, but because those in power never give way. And this, gives rise to one of his really, most impressive phrases over the top of page 128, when James writes, "Had the monarchists been white, the bourgeoisie brown, and the masses of France black, the French Revolution would have gone down in history as a race war." First and foremost, he is aligning those things. He's saying that is how to understand the correspondence between these classes in the transnational sort of class constellation. But the point of what he's saying is the only reason it's not understood as a race war is because it's not understood to be a racialized context. It's understood to be a context marked by class, power, and privilege. That's the only difference, according to James. It would have otherwise gone down as a race war. And he says immediately after that, but although they were all white in France, they fought just the same. So the question is not that elites waited too long to grant this tiny little passive revolution to save the system because of race. Race is a crucial piece, and maybe he's underplaying it here, right? Because I want to keep emphasizing the fact that they waited so long because they couldn't see the potential of a slave revolution actually breaking out. But he's more focused on the fact that they were simply fighting to protect their privileges, which he says any ruling class, any group of powerful people will do. And immediately after that, he paraphrases, or it's more than a paraphrase, it's almost a direct quote, the Communist Manifesto, when he says the struggle of classes ends either in the reconstruction of society or in the common ruin of the contending classes. And he's trying to say here that France was reconstructed, as he puts it. It laid the basis of modern France, whereas so corrupt and rotten was the slave society of San Domingo that it could not stand any strain and perished as it deserved to perish. Again, he's looking for historical laws about the ways in which those in power refuse to sort of see the way the wind is blowing until it's far too late sometimes. Now, to be clear, Sontenax had not abolished slavery. In Le Cap, he had simply offered weapons and freedom to those who fought on the French side. But there's really no way to put this genie back into the box. And even those who had not joined him initially, in James's words, then refused to be slaves any longer. And they engaged in a widespread way in what was essentially a general strike kind of action across San Domingo. They refused to work even if they weren't joining the fighting. And so in August of 1793, Sontenax, the commissioner, the French commissioner in San Domingo, declared slavery abolished on the island. Now, only on the island, that's his sort of power, and only where the French controlled, right? So this is not absolute freedom, absolute abolition yet, but the main commissioner of the French, who controls sort of the northern half of San Domingo, has declared the abolition of slavery. In James' words, it was his last card, and he could not help himself. It was literally his last-ditch effort to save the French colony and to save the relationship with sugar production. Now, we need to remember why and how all of this happened, because we need to remember what it means for history, right? It happened because the French were under siege. Their backs were to the wall. They could not win without the black masses. The same scenario that Lincoln had faced or would face 70 years later. The same scenario. No one in the North wanted Black freedom, first and foremost. Then even when they were talking about freedom, no one wanted Black soldiers. They didn't think they would fight. They didn't think they would be part of the army. Then they started to realize they were the best soldiers. Then they started to realize they knew how to fight against the system better than any white soldiers from the North. Then they realized they would, if they withdrew Black labor from the South, be able to defeat the Confederacy. That was why abolition happened in the US. That is why abolition is happening in San Domingo, because their backs are against the wall again. The rich are only defeated when running for their lives. That's the only time they begin to give up those privileges. Now, if this would happen with, this scenario would confront Lincoln 70 years later, it was one that would confront Simón Bolívar much, much sooner, and with far clearer resonances just a couple decades later. Despite the fact that Simón Bolívar had taken refuge in Haiti, and that he was pressed by the then President Pétion to free the slaves, he was armed and funded and supported by the Haitian government. That's a crucial piece to sort of bear in mind. This is Simón Bolívar, who's then going to liberate much of South America from Spanish rule. Despite that, Bolívar still hesitated to free the slaves because he and his class of white criollo elites were deathly afraid of what they called the pardocracia, the rule of non-white masses. This was a sort of something that scared the shit out of them, and it scared them even more after the Haitian Revolution, right? The specter of the Haitian Revolution becomes something which scares all white elites. But just like the French, in this case, Bolívar too was being defeated, and also being defeated by an ostensible royalist. In the Spanish caudillo, his name was José Tomás Boves. He's a Asturian from the north of Spain. What did Boves do? He armed the poor. He armed the indigenous. He armed the enslaved masses. He gave them sort of freedom in practice. He gave them equality in practice. And he unleashed them across Venezuela on the wealthy white population. He said, listen, you can go seek your revenge. You can loot, you can take over, you can engage in all of the kind of violence and steal all of those goods that have been kept from you for so long. This is what Boves was doing. Again, Boves still scares elite Venezuelans today, which is funny, it's been 200 years. But the point here is that it was only because Boves was defeating him that Bolivar would free the slaves. It was only because he himself needed to free and arm enslaved people that he did so to win independence. He didn't have a choice. That is how history progresses, right? In James's phrase. And the decision that Toussaint confronted also resonates with other instances in US history. I think this is super interesting. The so-called American Revolutionary War, what Gerald Horne calls a counter-revolution, of course. In the War of 1812, you had many enslaved people fighting on the side of the British because that was the side that was more likely to grant them freedom, right? In the War of 1812, you had enslaved people joining, swimming out and jumping on British ships to leave at the end of the war. Again, we are, I think, so cooked by US, revolutionary ideology that we don't understand, or even when we do understand that this is a slave society, we don't understand that means that enslaved people have no fucking interest in this society, right? And so you have many situations in which enslaved people are joining any other cause, because why would enslaved people make any other choice whatsoever? Now, Sonthonax's declaration of the abolition of slavery still wasn't enough for Toussaint to switch sides immediately. Why? And this gets back to the question. Because he had an army of 4,000. He was winning victories left and right. And he was winning them not so much, and here again, what is the thing behind the word? Not so much as a soldier and an officer of the Spanish crown, but as a soldier fighting for the still enslaved Black Haitians in the West and the South, right? This was the reality of what he was doing. And the way James describes it on 131, he says, although he had fought under the flag of the counter-revolution, he knew where his power lay. and under the very noses of the Spanish commanders, he continued to call the blacks to freedom. If things were not already immensely complicated, it is at this moment, in late 1793, that the British invade what they perceive to be a very defenseless island, and they're, immediately given a warm welcome by the most reactionary elements of the propertied classes of San Domingo. Again, I mean, if it's not becoming clear up to this point, we often say the working class has no nation. The ruling class has no fucking nation, right? They're treasonous to the core. They talk about nation when it suits them, but they are the first to betray it in the name of their class interests, right? This is particularly true in this context where you've got Spanish, English, French, all operating in very close proximity. So the elites are now embracing the English. I think they called them they previously called themselves the new, what they call them, the new citizens of the Spanish crown or something like that, to just name the fact that they were completely betraying the French. For James, this English invasion, British invasion, is a global tipping point. If the British had won this richest of colonies, it would undeniably be the global hegemon at that point, but it would also be a slave society. It would have tipped back in the direction of embracing slavery rather than continuing on the sort of weak and sort of mealy-mouthed path of abolition that had been on up to that point, having sort of abolitionist commitments that were like an inch deep, right? In Paris, however, the tides were shifting dramatically and quickly. And here, where are we? Over toward page 138. As James describes it, Robespierre was no communist, but he was prepared to go further than the Girondins, and the masses knew what they wanted. The masses were mobilized, they were politicized, they were increasingly abolitionist, and so they then, in the context of Paris, threw their weight behind what's referred to as the Montagnards, the very left wing of the Jacobin movement, and behind Robespierre in particular. They forced the Girondins out of the convention entirely, in other words, forcing them out of the legislature. They seized them, they seized many, others fled to join the counter-revolution. And so you've got this moment of dramatic sort of polarization within the French Revolution. Previously, you'd seen the kind of royalist segment split off and go join the counter-revolution. Now you see the centrists, in other words, the Girondins, who had been the centrist of the revolution, the sort of large and propertied bourgeoisie of this bourgeois revolution, you see them being expelled. So now you see a government that is not representative of the bourgeoisie as a whole, and whose driving force is actually the revolutionary masses from below. If you look on page 138, and again, taking this in light of the 1,500 already executed, taking this in light of what is coming in the French Revolution, James writes, when history is written as it ought to be written, the thing that he's doing, right? When history is written as it ought to be written, it is the moderation and the long patience of the masses at which men will wonder, not their ferocity. It is the patience of the masses. Again, very similar to the argument about violence, right? This is not, the violence of the oppressed is not going to be ever as significant as the violence of the oppressors, and yet all we hear about is the violence of the oppressed, right? It's used to demonize, it's used to discredit, and it's used to sort of kind of rationalize the process as it's unfolding. So it is this government, in other words, this government in the hands of the far left of the assembly, that from March 1793 to July of 1794, finally and truly abolished feudalism. In other words, not the bourgeoisie, but this sort of more radical sector of the bourgeoisie with the support of the masses. And here again, even in this situation, James is emphasizing the fact that the Jacobins and the Montagnards are doing this under some kind of duress. Further down the page, he says that the Jacobins took the people into its confidence, or this government took the people into its confidence, for it had nobody else to depend on, right? This was the basis and the foundation of its power. It had to embrace cause of the masses, even though he says this government is hostile to communism. A rare exaltation of sacrifice and devotion moved through revolutionary France and Paris. As in Russia, under Lenin and Trotsky, the people were told honestly of victory or of defeat. Errors were openly acknowledged, and where to this day reaction can only see a few thousand people who fell under the guillotine, Paris between March 1793 and July 1794 was one of the supreme epochs of political history. Now, the latter part of this period is what we often hear described as the Great Terror. Right? Again, that is a language used to discredit it. There's an entire thread of French historiography that is geared toward stoking fear and panic about the terror of the French Revolution. Right? The point is that revolution, and that all revolution is dangerous and a mistake. Right? That we should always look for compromise and always look to sustain and maintain what existed before. These debates happened around the time of the French Revolution. Royalists were trying to argue we should have a kind of constitutionalist monarchy, we should preserve what exists, we should not move too quickly. And the French Revolution is understood as that revolution that moved far too quickly. Right? Too quickly, even according to the Marxist trajectory, right? It's not a bourgeois revolution at this point, it's something far more radical, or potentially, right? So James is already framing the terror in a very different way for us, and we'll talk a lot more about this next week. Bourgeois historians are themselves often carrying water for the dying aristocracy that they claim to oppose, and so they speak only of the guillotine. But for James, this was one of the supreme epochs because of the closeness between the masses and political power. That's what's key, right? Never until 1917 were masses ever to have such powerful influence, for it was no more than influence upon any government. In these few months of their nearest approach to power, they did not forget the blacks. So he's saying a few things here. This was the closest the masses ever got to power during the far left Jacobin government. They were still not in power. That will become very important, right? This was not a direct rule of the masses or the sans-culottes. This was the Jacobins ruling from above, in alliance with and with the support of the masses. And thirdly, in that moment, right, in that sort of moment of supreme radicalization between the masses and the government in Paris, they're the most aligned and the more aligned than they ever would be with the black masses in Santo Domingo, right? All of these things are happening in this supreme epoch of the revolution. And he continues, he said, they felt toward them as brothers, and to the old slave owners whom they knew to be supporters of the counter-revolution, they hated as their Frenchmen themselves had suffered under the whip. Again, this kind of contagion of categories between their own understanding of oppression and what they knew to be the very real oppression that people were struggling against in Santo Domingo. In February 1794, as a result of this dynamic, the convention declared slavery abolished in all the colonies, right? In this moment of radical furor. Slavery, the National Convention declares slavery abolished in all the colonies. In consequence, it declares that all men without distinction of color domiciled in the colonies are French citizens and enjoy all the rights assured under the Constitution. This was an act, as James puts it, of generous spontaneity. It didn't reflect the class interests of those progressive bourgeoisie in the convention that were making the decision. They themselves were carried away. They themselves were pushed from below by the power of the grassroots. And it reflected as what James describes on page 141 as the overflowing desire which filled all France to end tyranny and oppression everywhere, right? The zeal of this revolutionary movement. It also marked, it's worth emphasizing, we'll talk more about this, the doom of the Spanish and British invasions of the island as well, for reasons that are probably obvious at this point. This happened in February. Toussaint heard about it in May, and he immediately joined the French. They made him a brigadier general, and he immediately turned on the Spanish and the British with what James describes somewhat fittingly as tigerish leaps. Tigerish leaps, destroying and decimating his previous allies. Leaps is interesting. James would, in a couple decades, less than 2 decades, write a book called Notes on Dialectics. Very important book. And he didn't have access to it at this time, so it's very interesting that he's talking about leaps, but leaps is a very dialectical word in general, right? We're not talking about gradual movement, we're talking about leaps. And what's very interesting is that one of the texts that the Johnson Forest tendency would lean on in its later years, and particularly in this writing of Notes on Dialectics, was what's referred to as Lenin's conspectus of Hegel's Science of Logic. Sounds very fancy. It's actually just Lenin like scribbling these notes all over the margins as he's reading Hegel's Science of Logic. And then James, and using this translation that Raya Dunayevskaya had done of this sort of conspectus, James is writing about dialectics on that basis. But one of the things that Lenin writes in the margins as he's reading Hegel is leaps, 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 right? This is a huge part of how he understands these sort of transitions, these abrupt transitions that change everything kind of overnight. Still dialectical in the sense that they're carrying the dynamic tension that existed in the world previous, but leaps in the sense that those moments, those breaking points are what really launch us into the next phase. So Toussaint is leaping on his enemies. The Parisian masses have made a series of unprecedented leaps in consciousness, in organizing, in sort of self-confidence when it comes to power. And of course, the Haitian slaves are doing the same quickly. Cool. Let's take some questions and have some discussion. Next week, we're talking about 2 chapters. We're talking about 6 and 7. I just wanted to sort of put that out there before we get into the conversation for the rest of the night. Slavery is abolished. Toussaint's back on the side of the French. The revolution is not nearly over. Don't worry, it's only 1793 or 1794 at this point. Yeah, middle of 1794. We've got a good decade left. What are people thinking? What kind of questions have y'all got?
I guess what's on my mind is how Toussaint stays on the side of reaction and is able to maintain his support for freedom without getting dragged in, like the 2 other generals mentioned, as being firmly on the side of the Spanish. Like what we should be taking away from that kind of shaky and uneasy alliance that you might have with the reactionary force for your own ends.
Mm-hmm. What do we take from that? His ability to sort of ride 2 horses at once. I mean, I think we take a couple of things. One is, again, a statement on who Toussaint is and how he had gotten to that point. If you remember, these are some of the same Black generals who had engaged in what James calls Judas work, right? The attempt to sell out the enslaved people to exchange their own freedom for the re-enslavement of the majority of the population, right? So first and foremost, you have the potential for treason against the masses. You have the fact that these generals are not necessarily motivated by the sort of foundational principle of the thing, which is abolition, right? They're much more motivated by their own sort of position. And this is, to be clear, when the attempted treason is happening a couple of years before, when there's an attempt to sort of sell out the Black insurrection, they say something very interesting about, they say, yes, of course, we're negotiating on behalf of the slaves who are rebelling, but don't worry, we can get them to go back to the plantations. 2/3 of them don't even speak French, right? So there's very interesting internal dynamics within the sort of otherwise unified Black masses, and a very clear hierarchical position among these sort of more educated or more experienced in some cases, but uneducated leaders of the sort of rebellion, right? It's that moment, it's that failed betrayal, the failed treason that leads Toussaint to what James says, the position that he would never stray from, which is absolute abolition to be held by force. So according to James, this is something he comes to, and at that moment begins to train the army. And again, as he's training the army, this is what allows for the alliance with the Spanish, which is that he is not asking to be part of the Spanish counter-revolution, right? He's not asking to join and be a recognized general of the Spanish army, or to somehow be granted access to the means of force by the Spanish. He has the means of force, right? He's built the army. It starts as 500 or 600. By this point, it's 4,000, right? At 4,000, he doesn't need to ask anyone's permission, really. And we're actually going to see that dynamic play out a lot, because this is not the last question, right? The question then is, I mean, he'd been on the side of the counter-revolution, but again, what was the revolution offering them? Nothing. Then the question is going to be, how do you stay on the side of France, right? How is it possible to be, in the words of Toussaint's 1801 Constitution, free and French, if you're a colonized people, right? So that question, that I think you're raising a really good one, how does he maintain himself and his principle in the context of making these strategic sort of decisions? I think it's an important one, yeah. What else we got?
It's interesting, like rereading this, thinking of this balance in CLR James' writing between like all of the detailed content of the Haitian Revolution and the identification of historical laws, as you keep drawing our attention to. And I'm just wondering if we can get at some of these historical laws, particularly this notion of Hegelian struggle, producing shifts, whether that's in history or in consciousness. It's interesting to think through, and it's absolutely the case in 2020 when the police precinct was burned down in Minneapolis, that regular ass folk all of a sudden were saying things like, well, if the police are going to keep killing people, what do you expect? And they were never saying shit like that a year or two before, right? So like the proof is in the pudding a little bit, right? But then I think about what came immediately after that moment. The kind of academic inundation and all of these Zoom conferences and get this book on abolition, get this book, you know, on whatever comes next. And it was a very fleeting kind of a moment. So I'm just trying to think about the elements of these historical laws. And I guess I would kind of put it like this, where it seems sometimes that James, maybe in a Marxist tradition, is thinking of these shifts like as moments of recognition. There's a recognition that an enslaved person is a person because of struggle, and that produces a shift, almost like in propositional consciousness, like we could write out sentences. This was my prior belief. Then I witnessed the struggle, and now I've revised or updated that belief, and I have a different proposition in my consciousness. My consciousness has shifted. Whereas when I think of what happened to Minneapolis and things, although people could put words to something that they were feeling, I wonder how much of it is actually conscious. Like, I kind of counterpose like this moment of recognition of like a propositional consciousness. Oh, I recognize this moment of struggle. My consciousness shifts with something more like this unconscious intuition of forces. Like, I feel like those people who were saying, well, what do the police expect? We're almost kind of more hedging their securities, because there's a kind of semi-conscious or unconscious feeling of danger now.
Yeah.
That there's a real shift that maybe they couldn't fully describe in terms of the society they live in, and all of the foundational security providers that they take for granted in the day-to-day have been shook. And in that moment, they might say something different, but they're still pushing to restore that, right? And once that's restored, they go back.
Yeah.
And I think it's kind of similar to like this moment in the American Civil War. And it's cool to hear more about the moment that Bolivar faced too, and thinking about these three moments in history. And the way that Saidiya Hartman would call the decision by Lincoln to emancipate a non-event, right? And it actually kind of concealed the continuation of slavery by another name, right? And when we fast forward the story a little bit, we know what happens to Haiti and to Haitians, and how Europe continues to treat them and their role in the world. So I'm just wondering, if we, I don't know, get at the dynamics of the historical laws a little more, and think about, you know, is it a consciousness shift, or if it has to do with feelings of security and insecurity, it seems then something like a permanent revolution, right, or something would be more necessary to cement and push that, whatever that change that we're going for is.
No, it's a great question. First and foremost, when you said at this moment in the Civil War, and you were talking about what I had mentioned earlier, I thought you meant like this moment in the U.S. Civil War, which is also a very interesting moment in the U.S. Civil War, where things are getting hot again. The U.S. Cold War has become a hot Civil War. That's a great question, right? And I think it's something that, you know, we could talk about in terms of how we see 2020, and yet that also, like, you know, then try to sort of like thread into that things we know about James and the way he understands these sorts of things, right? James being someone who, in some ways, doesn't, you know, he doesn't believe that people suddenly magically then develop consciousness and it's suddenly magically sort of a permanent thing, but he does believe, maybe more than we do, that there's this underlying baseline of potential consciousness that exists in all sort of oppressed communities, right? And James is someone who sees us as constantly leveraging that, transforming it, allowing it to emerge, right? So what we're talking about in Minneapolis for James would be on some level an emergence of something that's already there, but it emerges because of the dynamics of a kind of situation, right? And again, here, you know, I begin to think in terms of, less in terms of James and more in terms of just my own sort of analysis of the situation, which is that we see a series in a cycle, an escalating cycle of rebellion against police violence, right? But that we do see qualitative shifts across those, right? We see conceptual shifts, we see innovations, we see 92 is not the same as Oscar Grant, is not the same as Trayvon Martin, and certainly not the same as Ferguson in Minneapolis. And there's this great quote by a sort of, you know, someone from Black Visions in Minneapolis that said, previously we knew what the problem was, now we know what the solution is, right? And over the course of just a few years, that's because certain understandings, abolitionist conceptions about what it would mean to build alternative kinds of institutions and use those as the basis for thinking through a kind of thoroughgoing abolition. This is something that had been developed in the course of those struggles, which is to say the consciousness gained in that kind of Hegelian way through the struggles doesn't all disappear. But we know lots of things happen, right, when the fires are put out. People go back to work, students go back to school. That's one of the most fucked up things, right? It's like college students go back to school. And those, it's not like they're bad people, right? But it's that those are institutions that are telling them that they need to be focused on what they're gonna do after they graduate, right? So they're sort of instrumentalized in that own kind of way. We know that after the fires go out, the nonprofits arrive. They arrive to do counterinsurgency work, to sort of repair on some level, but to repair in a way that is a kind of sort of passive revolution of its own. And so we know and we know that the broad narrative is, wow, that was a really unnecessary and unfortunate break with normality. And we need to go back to some sort of adjusted form of what reality should look like. So this is counterinsurgency, right? This is soft and hard counterinsurgency that comes in the aftermath of rebellion. It happened in 2020. Both forms exist. One of the forms of, we always emphasize this abolition school, right? One of the main forms of soft counterinsurgency is to say everyone's abolitionist, everyone, just like everyone's anti-colonial, everyone, it's like, no, we need to be clear about what we're talking about and what abolition needs to mean. And I think you get to it right at the end, right? When you said there's a temporary disintegration that allows for these alternatives to appear, and they need to be substantiated in their own ways, right? Which is why we always say we need spaces like this, right? We need to gather people and build political education. We need to know that, and we're talking about, again, when we're talking about who was radicalized by 2020, it's almost everyone, right? It's like, Zoomers, alphas, like all of them, like this is what they have known, and it's with them, right? The question is, what does it mean to them, and how do we allow it to have meaning to them, right? So what do you do with the people who've been mobilized, influenced, impacted on a mass level, and what kind of institutional sort of continuity can you provide to that? And I think it's a great question. I think, right? You mentioned that question of abolition. You mentioned, and this very much applies to like civil rights struggle as well, right? It's not that nothing happened, right? And I disagree with those that said nothing happened in 1865 and nothing happened in 1965, but it's far from everything, right? And as Du Bois puts it in Black Reconstruction toward the end, back towards slavery, right? Not the same exact thing, but a new sort of configuration of the same, and we live on that terrain still today. So I think for James, we're talking about historical laws in which struggle, in a kind of Hegelian sense, generates self-consciousness, in which there's, and I'm trying to, this is at least as much me as him, trying to sort of find this in here, that there's a specific way that has specific resonances in struggles that involve white supremacy and slavery, right? There's a doubling of that kind of impact. However, that is not everything, and that's just the level of consciousness, right? What then happens on the institutional level? And not only is it the fact that we're talking about incomplete revolutions that are then aggressed from the outside or reversed, right? We're talking about Haiti itself not moving beyond plantation production too. And that's something that Toussaint and Dessalines and Henri Christophe and everyone participates in. So that's more toward the end of the story, but yeah, that's such a good question. What else?
Okay, so we have two questions. But before I get into that, people really appreciated the last question. People really liked that there was a lot of energy in the chat. I just wanted to bring that into the physical space as well. Okay, so first question is, can you speak to the role of time as a material for leaping and abrupt transition? If news takes longer to arrive to Toussaint / the masses, are leaps more probable with slowness / how do we slow? Okay, feel good about that one? And then piggybacking off of that question, someone else asked, Gio, in your understanding, is it harder to make those leaps that Hegel described and Lenin emphasized in this age of quick info exchange and transmission? Toussaint learned of quote, emancipation months after February, where now there could be swift reaction instead of long stretches of being in the way of now, where those leaps could germinate. I'm interested in comparing Haiti, African anti-colonialism, and Caribbean independence compared to opportunities today.
Mm-hmm. These are very related.
And let me know if you need me to repeat any part of that.
Could you sort of repeat the second one just a little bit as I think about it? Yeah.
So piggybacking off of the first question, the second person asked, Gio, in your understanding, is it harder to make those leaps that Hegel described and Lenin emphasized in this day of quick info exchange and transmission? Toussaint learned of, quote, emancipation months after February, where now there could be swift reaction instead of long stretches of being in the way of now, where those leaps could germinate.
Yeah.
I'm interested in comparing Haiti, African anti-colonialism, and Caribbean independence compared to opportunities today.
That's super interesting. And they're really kind of intertwined with each other. There's a bunch of things to say, right? And we've hinted at this a little bit. We were talking about space last week, about the role of space in the generating of revolutionary consciousness, but also the role of space in every revolution, right? And I want to be super clear about it. One of the main lessons of the failures of the Latin American guerrilla struggle in many countries was this idea that had developed out of this misunderstanding of the Cuban Revolution that guerrillas could be engaged in these sort of quick hit and run attacks and then disappear and not be tied down to any kind of territory, and that would help generate revolutionary consciousness among the masses. That wasn't what happened in Cuba. This French thinker then extracted an idea about it, wrote a book about it, and then made people think that was what had happened. That's Rishi Debray, for those that don't know. And yet when he published that book, then people were like also trying to do the same thing across the continent, failing miserably, and they're failing because they are not taking and holding space, right? That means several things. It means that they're not governing space. It means they're not practicing politics together. It means that they're not engaging with local populations, right, in a productive way that points toward an alternative kind of society. But it's fundamentally because if you hold space, you are creating time, right? So if we're talking about slowing, how do we slow and create the possibility to leverage sort of historical time as the material for change, as I understood it in that question? It requires something like that process, right? There's other ways, I'm sure, but seizing space is a good way to seize time. And we see that in Occupy. I wrote this piece about it. I was talking about pieces about Occupy, pieces about the student movement in California in 2009. One of the things about Occupy is that it's not just a march, right? It doesn't start at 10 a.m. and end at 1 and everyone goes home, right? It continues, right? And it continues in a way that brings people together and creates politics in that space, and explicitly a politics of kind of self-governance and collectivity, right? And it seizes time in a way that forces your enemies to go on the offensive, right? It puts the impetus on them, right? You have to be there in a place where they want you to leave and force them to then engage you and create a kind of dialectic of struggle, in that way, right? A march doesn't do that, right? Not just because it's a march, but for the most part, if we're talking about a march that doesn't break things or burn things, it's a march that, can be easily ignored, right? So seizing space is key to seizing time, right? And I really, really want to emphasize that. I don't know, I think it is a slowing, right? I think I'm not sure I fully embrace the idea of slowing, but maybe something like holding, right? And this is very like a Fred Moten kind of category. It would be like holding, right? A holding pattern, a holding of space, thinking about how it is that we're shuttling back and forth, as Moten puts it, between space and dispossession and space and dispossession, right? And there are many ways in which this is misunderstood by the Marxian tradition. There's this idea that holding and owning space is like a conservatizing thing for Marx. And yet, especially today, and this sort of transitioning into the second piece, especially when you've got circuits of quicker and quicker movement, the ability to hold space is a way to disrupt those, right? So for example, resisting displacement is a way to disrupt real estate circulation, right? You had, a whole wave of protest very famously in Argentina, but this has become a more generalized thing, where especially workers who are not, or working class people who are not in a space that they can occupy like a factory, have to transform their tactics to something like blocking highways, right? In the Piquetero movement, right? Because this is the circulation of capital. How do we obstruct it and create that kind of, new temporality by seizing space? Okay. Now, is it harder to make leaps today in the sort of Leninist conception? Toussaint learned about abolition and many other things much more slowly. I don't know. That's a good question. I don't think it's necessarily a good thing that Toussaint didn't know about the abolition of slavery right away. I think it leads to different kinds of dynamics of communication, right? We've talked a lot about word of mouth. We've talked a lot about the fact that this was a largely non-reading population and there wasn't a lot of print media being circulated, but there was a lot of word of mouth and conversation that also led to the transformation of what those ideas actually meant, right? The exaggerations, sort of misrepresentations that were creative and productive. Now, the reason I hesitate to say that it's harder, because Lenin's whole thing, right, in What Is to Be Done, which is this sort of earlier piece, is about the role of the newspaper as organizing and generalizing the struggle, right? People don't know what's happening in different parts of Russia. We need the newspaper to circulate quickly so that people know that their struggle is part of a bigger struggle, right? So at the risk of sounding sort of predictably kind of trite, that's happening today, and it's happening incredibly quickly, right? The fact that we can, track what's going on in Gaza very quickly, the fact that we can track what's going on in different parts of the world has been really important, and it's been incredibly important to the viral expansion and spread of 2020 protests, right? Minneapolis set off a chain reaction that was bigger and broader than any other protest movement in US history, right? And that's because, in part, of this sort of distribution, right? And the distribution of images, violent images, images of oppression, that sort of, lead people to be mobilized. Now, I think, my tendency, I think, is just to see that as the terrain, right? The terrain on which a leap would need to look maybe different, or be formulated in a certain kind of way, or maybe happen quicker, or maybe happen slower, or maybe happen, and this is probably the answer, right, in a more scrambled way, where there are leaps happening and there's sort of counter leaps and there's counterinsurgency happening, and they're all happening very quickly, right? So our ability to navigate those things and not get absolutely overwhelmed by the movement of history, I think, is crucial, right? And this is, the same Lenin who very famously speaks of the sort of compression and decompression of time when he says there are decades where nothing happens, and then there are weeks when decades happen, right? So, and we know that, right? We know that the past 2 years have been years in which a century has happened. So, it's something that we have to keep up with, right? While preserving, while finding ways to hold space and time. What else? Cool. Sounds good. Thank you all so much. I really appreciate you being here. We wrapped up a little early. Good, because we've got 2 chapters next week. So please dig into those, and we will, we'll talk about the rise of Toussaint and the Mulattoes Try and Fail next week, chapters 6 and 7. Thank you all.